IVM.
El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que ya ves.
Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and every week on the show, I sit down with experts from the field of international relations to see if we can make a little more sense of the world around us. The sound clip you heard at the beginning of the episode is a chant by Chilean women protesting rape laws, a song that spread to many other countries around the world and was translated into many other languages. In India, protests have always been a tool to express citizen discontent. But currently, countries around the world are witnessing protests despite great personal risks from the COVID-19 pandemic. The Black Lives Matter protests in the US, the anti-monarchy protests in Thailand, the Belarusian protests against President Lukashenko are all just examples. There are plenty more happening offline, coordinated online, at local and national levels. This makes me wonder, why do people fundamentally protest? What methods do they use? How does social media play a role? And what drives people to protest despite a global pandemic? I'm very excited for my guest today because we began our journeys into the field of international relations from the same alma mater. Karen Natasha Tharo is a research and analysis associate manager at Janes, where she manages a team that works on data collection, analysis, machine learning, natural language processing, and artificial intelligence workflows. She's been tracking protests around the world for a while now, and we're going to get into the conversation with her after a short break where we hear from IBM podcasts.
Welcome, everybody, to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel. It's been a great week on the network this week. If you haven't been paying attention, please do listen to some of the shows. We had Chetan Bhagat. This was the first returning guest on Cyrus Says. Do check that out. Great episode. We had Palak Zatakia on Advertising is Dead. Really interesting conversation was had with Varun. We had another crossover on the habit codes. Zarina Poonawala showed up over there to have a discussion with Ashton about anxiety and pressure. Begin the Journey with Ashish Vidyarthi continues to kill it. Please definitely do check it out. An old friend, Vijay Koshi, was on Storytellers and Storysellers. Do check that out as well. And I'd like to mention one thing. If you're a Tamil speaker, you should definitely check out our podcast, Kadai Podcast Punyan Selvan. Kavita Jiva has done a fantastic job to finish up her first story. It is the last episode which just came out last Monday. Do check it out if you speak Tamil. It is an incredible achievement. Please do check that out. And with that, let's get you onto your show.
Hi, Karen. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm so glad that you can join us.
Thanks, Hamsini.
Okay, so whenever we're talking about the year 2020, right, I think it's a particularly interesting time to be alive, not only because of the pandemic, but also because we have a lot of protests that have been ongoing in India and around the world for more than about a year. And so since you worked a lot on protests, can you tell us how protests start and how they're different from riots or sort of other forms of it?
Okay, let's keep it as simple as possible. So first of all, in order to analyze a protest, the simplest way would be to view it as a movie or a drama. So you analyze the characters involved in the protest. So you need both the good and the evil characters, because as humans, we're not very used to looking at the gray area. So for individual anger and discontent to become a people's movement, to become a mass movement, you need three main characters. First, you need a victim, you need a hero, and you need the villain. So how does one then mobilize the masses using these characters? So theoretically, you need a rhetoric arsenal and you need the character work. The character work will then determine how one has to feel about these characters, which will then in turn inform the audience and will determine how big the protest becomes. So let's let's dive a little bit into this using the example of the Black Lives Matter protest. So the concept becomes slightly easier to grasp. So here the first character would be the victim, because without a victim, there is no problem that needs to be fixed, right? So the first step is to identify the victim and what we are supposed to feel for the victim. So here we have to feel empathy and you feel compassion. So in Black Lives Matter movement, the victims are Black people in specific and people of color in general. And the issue here is police brutality and systemic racism. Then, if you have a victim, you have to have the villain, right? So the villain is the problem. And what do you feel for the villain? You feel anger, you feel hatred, and you feel abomination, right? So in the Black Lives Matter protest, you see the police as the villain in specific, and you see white supremacists and racist people in general, right, as the villain. And then finally, you need the hero. So you need the protagonist. The hero in a movie or a drama is someone who saves, everyone and fixes the problem. So here in context of a protest movement, it's generally the victim who stands his or her ground and kind of like refuses to back down from the villain and then becomes a leader. This bravery of this victim is what encourages other victims to stand against the villain and therefore gather support from bystanders. That's exactly how you would see a movie. Now, a hero in a protest movement could also be, the sort of a symbolic slaughtered lamb. So in the Black Lives Matter movement, this is what we see. We see people like Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, who died and became the catalyst for a mass movement. So you see, every protest movement actually can be dissected like this. And historically, we have seen a wide range of, the means of protest or the forms of protest. In fact, everything from graffiti, music, dance, art can be used, as a symbol of individual or group protest. And then you have the more mass movement. So you have blockades, demonstrations, picketing, sit-ins, rallying, marches, etc. And all of these, if you can see that there is a trend that all of them are non-violent. Non-violent means of protest. And this essentially is the basic difference between a protest and a riot. The means used to show your discontent. So a protest is essentially non-violent, and a riot will use, violence and cause damage to property or people to essentially grab attention, right? And very often, peaceful protests obviously do turn violent. And how this happens is generally when the response to the peaceful protest is violent. So it could be the security forces, it could be the opposing faction, it could be anyone. The response to the protest when it turns violent, that is one of the reasons why the peaceful protesters then turn to violent means. However, this is not to say that all riots start as peaceful protests. That's absolutely not true. There are many cases, even closer to home in India, where you can see that the means were violent from the word go. So it was never meant to be a peaceful protest in any form. I think the most recent example we can give is what happened in Bangalore last month, where the one post on social media kind of incited violence and people destroyed, property, shops, they destroyed a police station. So, that is essentially the difference, the most basic level difference between a protest and a riot.
Okay, this is very interesting. I really sort of like your analogy of all of this playing out as sort of, a Bollywood movie. I'm just wondering, when it comes to a lot of the protests that we see these days, a lot of them profess to be leaderless, right? So in that sense, does the hero become the bystander? Because this is also sort of, this narrative is also created with keeping mobilization in mind, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
then it sort of becomes the journey of how you also become part of this movement?
Yeah. So let's take the Black Lives Matter movement again as an example, because it is one of the most recent examples of a completely decentralized protest. So there is no leader, there is no one person that you can identify as the one leading the movement or organizing these mass protests. But here the hero is symbolic. Here, the hero is the one who was, quote unquote, martyred for the issue. So, what happens is you have trigger events in Black Lives Matter movement. So, the movement itself started in 2013. It was then sort of formalized as an organization, and they started filing litigations here and there, filing lawsuits. A lot of things happened. But the protest movement, right, the protest part of the Black Lives Matter movement is like an on and off kind of a situation. And this is determined by trigger events. So in 2014, we had the Ferguson protest. In 2015, there was protest in another part. So then 2016, there was Philando Castile. Every year almost, I think since 2014, we've seen one or two trigger movements, trigger events that have caused the mass protest. Now, what happened this year in 2020 is what, is like a symbolic, the straw that broke the camel's back, because the protest is now not, kind of bound by geographical, boundaries. Initially, every trigger movement had a protest only within that state or within that district or something like that. This became a very widely accepted mass movement that actually found resonance not only within the US, also in Europe, also in Australia and other parts of the world. Now, why this happened was because of what the Black Lives Matter movement has done with the use of social media. You don't have one leader, but you still have representatives in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world, who are leaders of this Facebook page, leaders of the Instagram page, leaders of Twitter. So there's always still someone in charge, but that person does not become the face of the movement. So that person is not the hero. That person is not the symbol of the movement, but they use social media in such a way that, there are multiple leaders. So it is, in essence, it's actually decentralized, definitely. There is no one leader, but there definitely has to be someone who starts it, right? Like there has to be one person who says, let's do this. So that is what the Black Lives Matter movement did by empowering leaders across the country in different parts of the country to start their own movements. And eventually, after 6 or 7 years of seeing this as a hashtag, seeing this as a trend, seeing this on social media so many times, it has now like kind of embedded itself into the psyche of the entire country. Whether they are for it or whether they are against it, it's something that you cannot ignore. Like it's a trend that you have seen at least once. So this is why I would say the 2020 protest movement became a much larger affair. Like it found resonance in the entire country, despite being in a pandemic. Now, this is what I call the window of opportunity. Now, the pandemic itself, right, the way the government handled the pandemic was a cause for discontent, was a cause for, instability. Now, added to that, there was a trigger movement. And put both of them together, then people had to come out of their homes. And this is why I said it was like, the straw that broke the camel's back.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really great that you brought up the window of opportunity here, because I was thinking about that as well as you were speaking. And, it's incredible that this movement started a couple of years back and they sort of slowly built as disparate, small, localized movements, and it became national this year, right? So,
yeah.
So is this how the life cycle of most protests work these days? What would the life cycle of a protest be?
So I would definitely say Black Lives Matter movement is very unique. There have not been other examples that have been able to replicate this model yet, because it took a very long time, right? It's sort of very new for the rest of the world to think about decentralized movements fueled by social media, like the information campaign on social media. However, there is a life cycle of a protest, and that is also influenced by social media. So there's definitely what was before social media, where the life cycle was longer. It took more time to spread the information, to get more attention. Now everything has a very short span of time. So this it's the same concept. So first, the victim is identified, the issue is identified, and then the images and videos of the victim, so graphic imagery, is perpetrated widely. It's publicized widely in whatever communication medium is possible, mostly in social media. And what happens is this creates that opportunity, this creates that window of opportunity where you find people who are, who have compassion and who have empathy for the victim, as well as you build that hatred and kind of like, anger towards the villain. So doing both of these things at the same time. And then what happens is you have to identify a hero that kind of will work as a catalyst or work as a leader. As I've mentioned, like there could be two ways of viewing the hero. And this person then becomes the face of the protest. Now, this is not something new, right? So we've seen it in, the civil rights movement. You saw Rosa Parks was definitely not the first person to say, I'm not going to get out of my seat, right? But she did become the face of the entire movement, of the entire, civil rights movement. Now, this happens because of like different issues, different reasons like, popularity of the person, the identity of the individual, how much the people resonated with that person's story. So a lot of these things like determine who becomes the hero of the movement. Another example I could give is in Tunisia, what led to the Arab Spring. All of us have read it. It was one fruit vendor who, self-immolated because of everything that was happening with the economic conditions there. And that person, although, you may not see the face of the person, but that identity of a poor person, of a fruit vendor, having to take such a drastic step, that identity of the person becomes the hero of the movement, like the symbol of the movement. After that, what you have to do is organize the protest. So once you have identified the victim, the hero, and the issue, and you have also, gathered that attention that the issue deserves by getting compassion, by getting that sort of emotional reaction from the audience, then you organize the mass movement. Now, this is something that becomes difficult, and this is something I feel is, culturally impacted as well. So in most countries, the first responders to any issue, first responders in this sense, I mean, is the first people to respond to a call for mass movement would be students, right? And why is that the case? Because it's easier for students to mobilize just because, one, they are primarily in contact with a very large number of people just because of the proximity of, of the university kind of a setup. And also, just as you grow older, as your friend circle like reduce, the number of people you meaningfully interact with also reduces. So older people may not necessarily have that many people to go back to get that support, but students on the other hand have that advantage. They have the energy, they have the numbers, and they have the close proximity to what we can call as allies. So allies are basically people who will support your movement. Now, then what happens is, in order to make the movement bigger, to engage more people and widen the scope, what you do is you get in more potential allies. And these potential allies then could be celebrities, They could be bystanders, like, there could be a legislator who has probably not decided which side of the issue he or she wants to stand on. It could be that person. It could be other interest groups. It could be other protest groups. All of these people are potential allies. So what you essentially do is you use their fan base, you use their audience, to draw their attention to your issue. And that is how the movement keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. After that, there is a very, very small window of opportunity for each protest to then achieve its objective. Because, all of us have a very short attention span, and a protest cannot go on for very long because, how much longer, what is the time limit for a person to stay on the streets all the time, right? At some point in time, the person has to come back and, go on with their daily life. So that is what we call that small window of opportunity. You have the attention of the audience, you have the attention of the target you intended. You have to kind of have the impact within that small window of opportunity. That is when a protest starts going longer, after that window of opportunity has closed down, that's when you stop getting coverage. That's when you stop getting the videos. That's when you stop getting the attention. That's when you stop getting the attention of the government also. So this is sort of like, it's a very tightrope kind of a walk that protest movements have to do. Achieve their objectives as soon as possible, which is very hard to do because if you have multiple objectives, if you have multiple demands, it becomes difficult to keep track of every single demand and give each of the demand the same attention. So this is also something that I've seen in some protests where they start off with one demand, which is great, which is always, I would say, recommended because the attention span of your audience and the targeted, like the government, right, is like they can focus on one thing. But if you keep adding, so this is something that is happening in Thailand, which I was slightly skeptical about, but I think it's slowly changing now. Was first they had 3 demands, and it was all around political reform. Then they had a few more demands here and there, and then within a month, suddenly their entire focus shifted to reforming the monarchy. So what happens is people also lose that kind of the audience lose interest. That is also something that happens. So this is a very tightrope walk that you have to do. Like you have to that is why first identifying your issue is, I think, the most important. Identifying your victim and your issue and keeping it as tight as possible. And I think all of the protests around the world have a very similar life cycle. Now, after this is done, the protests could either die down or, some other trigger event could happen and then the protest could be reignited again. So this is also something that we've seen in the US, we've seen in India, we've seen in other parts of the world as well. What happens in most countries now is that after you've got the attention, a lot of these leaders either start lobbying or campaigning. So they stop protesting, but start lobbying or campaigning, or they start going through the judiciary route. So this is another way to go. So you either formalize your organization, something that Black Lives Matter movement did, formalize your issue into an organization, and then you continue fighting for it, through the judiciary, or you formalize an organization, you create an institution that can start lobbying or campaigning for that issue, or, you just become the person who is in charge. And, like we've seen in India, we've seen in Hong Kong, some of the leaders of the protest then go the legislative route and stand for elections. So this is the kind of a similar, pattern that you can see in most of the places.
Okay, this is a lot to unpack here. And I think it's fascinating how you brought up sort of the Arab Spring and how social media affects so much of the Black Lives Movement and being decentralized. And I think this is something that the book Twitter and Tear Gas talks about a lot, because with social media and the 2011 protests, what you could see is that the revolution was not just being televised, but it was being tweeted, right? You were intimately familiar with the people who were showing up. And I was also thinking about what that meant particularly for young people now. all over the world, we say protests are seeing more and more young people turn up on the streets. And I think sometimes it's seen as, older people have so much more to lose. They have jobs, they have reputations and stuff on a sort of everyday basis. Whereas young people also have a lot to lose in the sense that their entire futures could hinge on what they're doing while at university. But they do have a lot more access to sort of allies. And I thought that was a really great point. Something that I was wondering when you were talking about sort of multiple demands and a single demand, I think one of the reasons why a lot of protests die down is because for them to become large scale and really pick up momentum, they all need to sort of merge together to form that one demand, right? But as soon as they're partially successful, they break back down into their smaller localized demands. And then you see the splintering of the movement. And I think that's something that I've noticed in protests lately. So that is something that I want to get your comment on. And the second thing is, the more that we look at sort of social media, is again, Twitter and Tear Gas talks about this idea of the networked protest, right? That multiple people across different countries are looking at each other and seeing what is happening. So do the protests around the world that are happening right now and have been happening in the last year, are they interconnected in some way?
Yeah. So I'll start with your second question and then move on to what you were talking initially. So one thing about globalization definitely is that, there's no isolation. Isolation is not an option for anyone anymore. So something that affects one country will somehow have a spillover effect in, the neighboring countries or the countries that have any sort of economic or political or any sort of relationship with that one country. And as you said, the social media is definitely something that gives you more than enough information. You get a live stream of every single event that is happening in a protest in another country, which kind of serves as it serves as an inspiration for other people. Now, something that I noticed, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the protests that happened in Thailand as well, you can see the Thai protests are student-led, right? So the young population of Thailand have realized that the Thai monarchy, as culturally, it is viewed as something that is so sacred that you cannot even talk about it, like you cannot even think about asking for a reform. Like that is considered a crime. They've realized that every other country in the world does not have something like that, right? So what happens with social media is that issues that you probably did not think were an issue, suddenly you are kind of forced to think about it. Now, this is something that I like to give an example of this, especially just because I'm a huge fan of K-drama. So this was something that I happened to see in the way the newer K-dramas, the topics they're talking about. So when the Black Lives Matter movement became a global kind of a trend, a topic, this was something that happened in India as well. There were conversations that you probably did not think could happen. Those conversations started, and they probably did happen before, but because of the fact that this was now like an international kind of a movement, now people started talking about a little bit more. And for a homogeneous kind of society like South Korea, where they didn't necessarily think of racism as a problem, they started talking about it. Like there were multiple debates that they had, like even on primetime television. They had newer K-pop idols who were not even like they weren't black idols, but they were definitely of Korean ethnicity, but probably of a tanner skin, who then started coming out and talking about the entire issue of racism. And also there were other people who are from Africa who are studying in Korea, who then started getting a voice to talk about these kind of issues. So that, I think, is the primary primary sort of way social media influences the way the youth now have started seeing themselves, seeing their own society. Because otherwise, you may not have thought about something as a problem, until you see what exactly can be, what else there can be. You won't really think about something that is, you've seen your entire life as a problem. Now, let's talk about the connectedness of all of this. So since 2018, actually, we've seen protests in at least more than 60 countries. And although not all of them received the same attention in the media, so there were many protests in Africa, in South America, in the Middle East that didn't receive the same attention. But since this is my job, I looked at all of these protests and tried to find some sort of a theme. So I wouldn't necessarily say they are connected, but they're definitely influenced by each other. So one of the themes is economic conditions, which is, not surprising at all. The world since 2017, we've seen inflation, we've seen low economic growth in so many countries. And, this is even more heightened in countries that have, governments that are kind of ridden with corruption and inefficiencies. So most of the protests in 2018 and 2019 actually started over extremely trivial things like the price of subway fares, like the ending of fuel subsidies, increase in fuel prices, like all of these things. Non-payment of salaries, non-payment of teachers' salaries, all of these things became an issue. And then people started realizing that it's not only us that, are facing this issue. There are also other countries that, are facing it. So if that country can protest for, non-payment of salaries or for hiking of fuel prices, we also should do something like that. So in that way, you could say it's connected, but not necessarily. It wasn't kind of like a domino effect. I wouldn't call it like that. But definitely there are some common themes that you can find otherwise. Another common theme is, democratic institutions. What is happening with, elections, election frauds? There are some arbitrary constitutional changes being made in some countries, stifling of public opinions, killing of human rights and, political activists. These are also very common themes. I think the newest theme in protest that we saw last year was the entire, protest against global warming. So like climate change and environment degradation. That became like the newer theme, which actually got more people involved. I think in almost 150 countries, if I'm not mistaken. Like more than 150 countries that participated in those protests. So they may not have the same, it's definitely not a domino effect, but they do get influenced by what happens, in other countries. Definitely say that.
Yeah, and I think, for me, I think the example of K-dramas are very cool because I also follow a lot of them. And I was thinking about how you had a lot of K-pop fan accounts or stan accounts that were then taking up the mantle on a lot of the Black Lives Matter
Yes.
handles on social media, which I found utterly fascinating. I think another sort of avenue for sort of this networked movement might just be looking at what sort of tactics work in different contexts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the Hong Kong protests for over the last year and a half have been really revealing for people in other countries. At least when I was looking at sort of the CAA protests, I thought that there was a lot that the CAA protests took from what people in Hong Kong had done. And I think that sort of, it's not a domino effect, but it's sort of just being inspired by those methods and then adapting them locally.
Yeah, it's exactly that. So, you see the entire life cycle of a protest happening in another country. You can see what works, what doesn't work, how to organize the protest, how to, what could they have done differently. You start analyzing those things yourself. And so then, you have more options when you probably want to organize your own protest. That's definitely one of the benefits of having social media. You get to see many, many different kinds of things.
Something that you'd mentioned earlier also is that, protest definitely depends on sort of cultural factors. And I was thinking about sort of India and how from the freedom movement onwards, we pride ourselves on sort of non-violently protesting for things and achieving the goals for which we protest for. So how do you think India's history of protesting has been affected by this? And how does it affect our present sense as well?
Yeah. So there's something that I can. One of these books that I was reading is basically, a cultural sociology kind of perspective of protest. So there's something that they said really well was, what does every country consider as an agency of protest? So in India, because we have learned that non-violent mass movements could, achieve the goals that were set that, violent means could not achieve in the freedom movement, protests in general have been accepted and have been accepted as necessary as well. The situation may be different in different regimes, in different political regimes, but in general, culturally, when an issue has been identified on whatever political spectrum you are, you do think of protest as the first response. That if you are unsatisfied with something, that's the first thing you want to do. Like, you would want to protest, and then the mass movement is something that you back up on. However, if you take a country, for example, the US, they of course do have a history of protest, but they've not seen protest as the first response. In the US, because the judiciary is kind of viewed as, extremely powerful and extremely responsive, the first, kind of a response probably would be to sue the government, which is an option that is used, by companies, it's used by individuals, it's used by state governments on the central government and vice versa. It's used a lot, right? Now, that is something that you could not probably imagine happening in India so easily. So that is what, so that every country then has this agency that is accepted, agency that you use as a form of, showing your discontent. So I think in India, we have learned that there is power in the masses, there is power in movement. So that, very naturally, the first response for any kind of issue is, to go and protest. And also hunger strike is something that, is very common in India, which I have really not seen as a common trend in most of the other countries that I look at. So it's very cultural as well as historical. You have to see how that particular tactic has been successful historically in that country. So that's how you start viewing it as a possible option or not.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about some of the other protests that are happening around the world. We spoke about Black Lives Matter, but I also want to speak about what's happening in Thailand and in Belarus. But before that, are there sort of other cultural aspects to protesting? I mean, in India, I guess hunger strikes would not be new if you're just from here or if you've been here for long enough. But are they different depending on where you are in the world? How would they be different?
Yeah, so I think the basic answer to this is, how do you draw attention in each country? That is what will determine, the culture of protest there. So in some countries, you may not need violence at all. Like, some countries are extremely peaceful, nothing ever happens. So that means if anything, any issue has caused a mass movement, the attention will immediately be given there. Some countries will use symbolism. Some countries will use literary symbolism, which is something that is happening in Europe, especially in Belarus. They use children's poems. They will use poetry. They'll use song. So this is the way these countries react. Like, these countries the people here can draw attention of the masses by using these moves. In South America, I'm sure you must be familiar with this. There was, a women's rights movement that, was mainly a demonstration of a very large group of women who stood in the middle of the city square, blindfolded, and they, sang a song called "A Rapist in Your Path." And that kind of resonated with a lot of other countries. And that song was translated in different languages and used as a form of protest in different countries as well. It's the same thing with demonstrations, same thing with rallying. So, what I would, if anyone who's interested in understanding the cultural aspects to protesting, I'd definitely say is do not be, don't look at it just as a demonstration. Don't look at it just as a rally. Don't look at it just as marching. Look at the symbols used. Look at what kind of, placards they're displaying, what clothes they're wearing, what kind of songs they're singing, what kind of art, they're using to kind of show their discontent. That will show you that the culture really impacts the way people decide what means they should use as a form of protest.
Yeah, that's very powerful. So now if we're talking about Belarus, I think that's a protest that's sort of on everyone's mind over the last month or so. What do you think of the protests that are happening against Lukashenko?
Yeah. So Belarus, I definitely find Belarus as a country, as a regime, very interesting in general. But the way they protested was even more interesting to me. So a little backstory here, if I may. It started in April, I think, around March, April, where there was just a businessman who used his own YouTube channel who started kind of live streaming these interviews that he was doing with random people across the country of Belarus. So he started using this children's poem that's in Russian. It's called The Monster Cockroach. And it's basically about how there's this tyrant cockroach that was eventually, eaten by a swallow, if I'm not mistaken. It was one of the birds. And this is what started the anti-cockroach revolution. So if you see a few pictures of the Belarusian protest, you can see, they don't use Lukashenko's images. You can see the placards. They just literally just a cockroach. And they will have the words of the poem written in it. So I found that extremely interesting because I didn't see much of it anywhere else. Anyway, coming back to the point. So this person, Sergei Tikhanovsky, he was arrested because of doing this, because his videos went viral. And essentially, Lukashenko took this opportunity to claim that this was a huge plot orchestrated by foreigners. Now, we're not sure whether he meant Russians or he meant Westerners, because he is known to kind of flirt with both sides whenever required. So he said that this was a plot by foreigners to remove him from office. And he also used this as kind of a trigger to get his opposition rival arrested on corruption and bribery charges. Now, what he didn't anticipate to happen was Sergei's wife, Svetlana, then announced her candidature and she stood for election. And then what happened is, I'm sure people are aware, is the results were declared and he got somewhere close to 90. It was declared that he got 90% of the votes. And Svetlana challenged it. And all of these people who saw these videos kind of realized. So what happened with these videos was all of the protests that used to happen in Belarus before were very, kind of localized. So it would happen in a city, it would happen in Minsk, it would happen in one or two places around. But people didn't know that the discontent actually was everywhere. Like the entire country had it. What these videos did was it made people aware that we're not alone. There are many more people who think that what is happening right now is not right. So then they got that kind of confidence to gather in much larger crowds. And that is why this protest is actually the biggest in Belarusian history. And what is interesting here is the way they tried to do it. So initially, they started in the night, which is something which most protesters don't do. So generally, protests start during the day. They started the protest in the night. And on Telegram, there were several posts that were intended at people who own cars to come and help the protesters. So basically, they asked people who own cars to block the entire road so that the protesters can get through, but the police can't. And the cars kept constantly honking all night. And the next day, some took to the sides of the road to literally just stand on the curb. Like, that's all they were doing. They said, we're not protesting, we're just standing on the curb. Some played chess, some played music, some just stood there. So these kind of things are not very, it's not like in your face. It wasn't that, listen, we are protesting, we are, everywhere. But it definitely put pressure, right? And there was another telegram memo that, called for protesters to throw nails and screws on the roads so that the police vehicles, the tires could be punctured and they couldn't reach the protesters. But what happened again, because this was a protest against the administration, the security forces then came back and responded in extremely violent ways. So that is why then the protest now has, sort of turned in a very violent capacity in some places. But there are still people who are continuing with these kind of silent ways to protest. Now, one of the symbols of protest in Belarus is the white, red, and white flag. And that has been used as a symbol of protest since 1995, literally the next year after Lukashenko was elected. And Lukashenko has ordered that anywhere in private balconies, wherever the security forces see these flags, they have to get it down. They have to remove it down. So what people are now doing is just hanging white, red, and white, underwear. They will hang in clothes. They'll hang random things. They'll wear a white kind of a bathrobe and stand with a red umbrella on their balcony. Like these are like the small, small creative ways that they continue to protest even without coming on the streets, which I find extremely, extremely creative and very interesting because it's not something we see very often in other places. So another thing I feel that I must mention is the involvement of, external actors. Now, Lukashenko wants to blame these protests on foreign interference or foreign actors. So he keeps saying that this is, they're paid by foreigners or it's a plot by foreigners to remove him from office. But what the protesters in Belarus have understood is that they will not let anyone hijack this protest. So they can keep maintaining again and again that this is not anti-Russia, this is not anti-West, this is purely a domestic issue and it is purely an anti-Lukashenko protest. Now, this is something that is very different in in these protests because a lot of other protests I have seen have somehow been hijacked by other people's narratives. Now, here, I believe that Belarusians have seen all of this happening on social media and have realized that they will not allow anyone else to hijack their narrative or throw in their goals within what they are doing. That's something I find extremely interesting with Belarus.
Ken, I think when you're talking about this, I find it sort of amazing how discontent can lead to sort of so much creativity in leading to people to ask for what they want and what they think is sort of like rightfully theirs. And and a lot of it is inspiring. When we move on to Thailand, what do you think of how the protests have sort of evolved there? Why have they taken a different turn in Thailand?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think before as well, Thailand, is a classic case of the youth getting information about what is wrong, what they have considered, they have been taught for a very long time as normal, as right. They are now starting to question those things. And one important feature, I feel like the Thai protest would not have received this much traction if the leaders of the Thai protest weren't from the political elite. There are a few leaders who are from the political elite, which kind of, is strange for people to think of, because why would they want to start protesting against their own, which is why they have been successful in getting that attention. Now, as I said, I was initially slightly skeptical of the route that the Thai protesters were taking, because initially, I think it was in February, they first started protesting because the party called Future Forward Party was dissolved. Then in July, it was reignited. And this time it became a more large scale kind of demonstration. And they had three clear demands in July, which were the dissolution of the parliament, the resignation of the entire cabinet, and drafting of a new constitution. However, within a month, there were more demands added. So within a month, so in August, there was this entire formalized plan of 10 demands that were added. And one of them included reforming the monarchy, which is what then led to arrest. So until then, they were allowed to like protest normally, and there wasn't too much of like a response from the security forces. But the moment they start questioning the monarchy, this is what happened, right? Now, this is again a cultural thing. In the entire, like the old population of Thailand, I think all of them still consider the monarchy as sacred, consider the monarchy as something that is, an intrinsic part of their culture, despite the fact that the new king, the present king of Thailand, he does not really enjoy the same admiration or loyalty, popularity of his father. They still consider the position, so the monarchy itself, as extremely sacred. However, the youth of Thailand have a very different perspective of this. They've seen a lot of information about the present king before he became the king. There are lots of like stuff written about him, about his lifestyle, about how lavishly he lives, about whatever, right? And people have realized that he interferes much more in the political, happenings of the parliament than probably his father did. And they've realized that this is actually not normal. It's not about the monarchy in itself, but it's more about how much power the monarchy is, using to influence the political, the cabinet and like the parliament. And this again, I would say, is because it's Thailand is not China, right? So they've not been they have an open and free, internet. They can see everything happening in every other part of the world, and therefore the Thai youth, as we've discussed before, have seen these kind of protests, especially in Hong Kong. They've seen these kind of protests in other countries and have realized this is not normal. This needs to be changed. And now there is an anti-protest protest. So now there are people who are supporting the monarchy who are protesting against the people who are protesting against the monarchy. So there's this whole pro and anti protest going on at the same time. But regardless of whatever the success or the failure, whatever the outcome of this movement will be, this is definitely an important turning point in Thai history, because never before was there a demand for any kind of reform for the monarchy. And they've realized that, this is the time they have to make at least a few changes to somehow subdue the youth of the country.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I think if we could sit and talk about protests all day long, just because there's so much ground to cover, considering how different every single country is, and how people, while they have their own motivations that are unique, also have motivations of discontent about basic rights that remain the same. Which brings me sort of to my last question, which is, if anyone wants to read more about protesting or protests or anything that you've spoken about today, what would you suggest for them to read or to consume?
So definitely, if you want to see a trend, if you want to kind of analyze the life cycle of the protest, you will have to do it the hard way and try to, look at the entire, all the events that have happened. But to think about this culturally and to think about this from a sociological, a psychological kind of perspective, This is the book I've used as well, and I think it's an excellent book. It's called Protest, A Cultural Introduction to Social Movements. It's by James M. Jasper. And this gives you such a different kind of a prism to look at protest, So it's not black and white. It's not always for and against. You can see that there are some people with different intentions who will try to hijack the protest. There are lots of like different perspectives that you can find from here. So this is definitely one recommendation that I can give.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you for coming today and for being so eloquent in your explanations about why protests happened. I hope you will come back and join us for a follow-up podcast at some point.
Definitely. This was a lot of fun, Hamsini. Thank you for inviting me.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I've attached Karen's recommendation along with some of my own in the episode bio, so do check those out. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. And every Friday, we organize a mini quiz on our Instagram page. So do come and test your knowledge of the world. States of Anarchy is supported by the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, IPSMF. We're super grateful to them for all of their support. We're also grateful to you, dear listener, for tuning in week after week. If you want to help us somehow, please leave us a rating on iTunes so that more people can discover us. You can listen to States of Anarchy on the IVM podcast app, but also on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Gaana, Savan, and every other podcast app on the face of the earth. We'll be back in a fortnight.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्ताने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें आईवीएम की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.